from nothing. 5 years ago, she was a struggling architect, sketching designs in coffee shops across London, dreaming of buildings that would touch the sky. Today, her firm bears her name on glass towers throughout Europe. But the man she married, Charles Whitmore, saw her success as something else entirely, an opportunity. When Clara found the forged contracts in his briefcase, documents transferring her biggest project to his name, she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply slid the diamond ring off her finger, placed it on his desk, and walked out of their Kensington townhouse without a single word. Charles assumed she'd come crawling back within days, broken and desperate. He had no idea that Clara Bennett wasn't the woman he thought he knew, and he certainly never expected what she was about to do next. Because sometimes the quietest exits create the loudest earthquakes, and Charles Whitmore was about to feel every single tremor. The morning Clara Bennett discovered her husband's betrayal started like any other Tuesday in their carefully curated life. She woke at 6 in their townhouse in Kensington, the kind of property that whispered old money through its Georgian windows and crown moulding. The neighborhood hummed with the quiet confidence of success. Black cabs gliding past wrought iron gates, professional couples in tailored wool walking perfectly groomed dogs, the distant bells of nearby churches marking time as they had for centuries. Clara had always loved mornings in London. There was something honest about the city at dawn, before the performance of the day began. She'd moved here 8 years ago from a small town in Yorkshire, arriving with nothing but a portfolio, a second-hand suitcase, and an architectural degree from a university no one had heard of. London had seemed impossibly vast then, a labyrinth of opportunity and rejection in equal measure. Now she stood in the kitchen of a £4 million townhouse, barefoot on heated marble floors, watching espresso drip into a handmade ceramic cup. The kitchen gleamed with professional-grade appliances and custom cabinetry. Everything in this house spoke of arrival, of having finally made it. Charles was still asleep upstairs. He'd been working late again, or so he claimed. These past 3 months, his absences had multiplied like shadows at dusk, late nights at the office, weekend conferences, emergency meetings that couldn't wait. Clara had noticed, of course. She noticed everything. It was what made her an exceptional architect, the ability to see what others missed, to understand how spaces revealed truths about the people who inhabited them. But she'd pushed her suspicions aside, buried them beneath spreadsheets and client presentations, convinced herself that success demanded sacrifice from both of them. Her firm, Bennett & Associates, had just won the contract for the Heathrow expansion project, a £200 million development that would cement her reputation as one of London's most innovative architects. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, the culmination of 5 years of relentless work. Charles had been so supportive when she'd won the bid. He'd opened champagne, ordered dinner from their favourite restaurant in Mayfair, told her how proud he was. She remembered how his eyes had gleamed in the candlelight, how he'd raised his glass to her success. She should have recognized that gleam for what it was. Clara carried her coffee to the study, intending to review the morning's emails before heading to her office in Shoreditch. The study was Charles's domain, all leather and dark wood, decorated with the trappings of his banking career. Degrees from Cambridge framed on the walls, photos from corporate retreats. That expensive chess set his father had given him, still in its original box, because Charles never actually played chess. He just liked the way it looked. The briefcase sat on his desk, partially open. Later, Clara would wonder what instinct made her look. Whether some part of her had known all along, had been waiting for confirmation of what her gut had been screaming for months. But in that moment, she simply saw the edge of a document protruding from the leather case and recognized the letterhead of her own firm. Her hand moved before her conscious mind could stop it. The contract was thick, official, bound with the kind of precision that legal documents demanded. She recognized it immediately, the Heathrow project agreement. But as her eyes scanned the pages, her coffee cup began to tremble in her other hand. The signature wasn't hers. Her name appeared throughout the document, but everywhere her signature should have been, she found an expertly forged version instead. And beside it, in the space marked Project Director, Charles Whitmore's name had been inserted. According to this contract, he was the lead architect. Clara Bennett appeared merely as an associate, a junior partner contributing to his vision. The coffee cup hit the floor, shattering against the marble. Brown liquid spread across the pristine surface like a stain on an X-ray, revealing the fracture that had always been there. Clara's hands moved mechanically, pulling document after document from the briefcase. Each one was worse than the last. Emails to the Heathrow board, written from a fake account that mimicked hers, recommending Charles as the primary contact for the project. Financial statements showing funds from her firm being quietly redirected to an account she'd never authorized. Letters of resignation, her resignation, drafted but not yet sent, removing her from her own company's leadership. He'd planned this for months, maybe longer. While she'd worked 16-hour days, while she'd poured every ounce of her creativity and energy into designs that would define her career, Charles had been methodically stealing it all. Not just the project, not just the money, her entire professional identity. The study suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Clara's breath came in short, sharp gasps. 5 years of marriage, 8 years of building her career from nothing, all of it. A lie, a long con orchestrated by the man who slept in her bed, who knew her vulnerabilities, who'd watched her claw her way up from poverty and saw not a partner, but a mark. She thought about confronting him, imagined herself marching upstairs, throwing the contracts at him, demanding answers. She could already hear his excuses, smooth as the silk ties he wore to the office. A misunderstanding, a surprise he'd been planning. She wouldn't believe them, but he'd try anyway, because men like Charles always believed their words carried more weight than evidence. But Clara didn't move toward the stairs. Instead, she carefully photographed every document with her phone. Each contract, each forged signature, each piece of evidence of systematic fraud. Her hands were steady now, her breathing controlled. The initial shock had burned away, leaving something colder and infinitely more dangerous. She thought of her mother, who'd worked 3 jobs to keep them housed after Clara's father left. Her mother, who'd told her that women like them didn't get second chances, that every opportunity was a fight. Clara had internalized that lesson, had let it drive her through university, through years of unpaid internships, through the casual sexism of architectural firms that assumed a young woman from Yorkshire couldn't possibly have anything valuable to contribute. And then she'd married Charles, and she'd thought she'd finally found someone who saw her as an equal. A Cambridge-educated banker from a good family who chose her despite her lack of pedigree. She'd been so grateful, so eager to prove herself worthy of his choice. The realization made her stomach turn. She'd never needed to prove herself worthy. Charles had been the one courting her, ingratiating himself into her life right as her firm began to gain recognition. She'd met him at an industry gala 4 years ago, just after she'd won her first major commission. He'd been charming, attentive, genuinely interested in her work. Or so she'd thought. Now she saw the timeline clearly. Every milestone in her career had corresponded with Charles's escalating involvement in her professional life. He'd encouraged her to share her designs with him, to discuss her strategies, to introduce him to her clients. She'd thought he was being supportive. She'd been too blind to see she was handing him the blueprint, to steal everything she'd built. Clara walked upstairs with measured steps. Charles was still asleep, sprawled across their bed in the expensive sheets he'd insisted they buy. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, studying him as if he were a building she needed to understand. Where were the structural weaknesses? What had she missed in the original inspection? But there was nothing to understand. Some people were simply predators, and she'd been prey. She went to her closet and pulled out a single suitcase, not the match set they'd bought for their honeymoon in Santorini, but the battered case she'd brought to London 8 years ago. It still smelled faintly of her mother's house, of the life she'd left behind. Clara packed methodically, passport, laptop, external hard drive containing every design she'd ever created, the jewelry her mother had given her. Nothing Charles had purchased. She wanted nothing from him, nothing that would tie her to this phase of her life. Her wedding ring sat on her finger, a platinum band with a diamond that had cost more than her first year's salary. Charles had made a show of the proposal, taking her to Paris, presenting the ring at the top of the Eiffel Tower while tourists applauded. She'd cried then, overwhelmed by the fairy tale of it all. Now she twisted the ring off her finger and felt nothing but relief at its absence. She placed it carefully on Charles's desk, next to his briefcase where he'd find it immediately. No note, no explanation. He'd understand soon enough. Clara called her most trusted associate, Maya Patel, as she loaded her suitcase into her car, a modest vehicle she'd bought herself, not the luxury model Charles had wanted her to drive. "I need you to do something for me," Clara said without preamble. "And I need you to do it today, without asking questions." "Clara, what's wrong?" Maya's voice crackled with concern. They'd worked together for 3 years. Maya knew her well enough to hear the steel beneath the calm. "Change every password on every system, bank accounts, email servers, client portals, everything. Use protocols only you and I know. Then call our attorney and tell him I need to see him today. Emergency meeting, not billable hours, cash payment. Tell him to bring someone who specializes in corporate fraud and identity theft." Silence on the other end of the line, then, "Jesus Christ, Clara, what did he do?" "Everything," Clara said simply. "He tried to take everything." She hung up before Maya could ask more questions. There would be time for explanations later. Right now, she needed distance, space to think, room to plan her next move without Charles's voice in her ear, his presence in her peripheral vision, his lies contaminating the air she breathed. Clara drove through London as the city woke around her. Past the Georgian townhouses of Kensington, through the financial district where Charles worked, into the creative chaos of Shoreditch where her office stood. She didn't stop. She kept driving, watching London recede in her rearview mirror, feeling something like freedom beginning to unfurl in her chest. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Charles was awake. He'd found the ring. The calls started, 3, 5, 10, in rapid succession. Then the texts began. Confusion at first, then anger, then attempts at manipulation disguised as concern. "Clara, where are you? This is ridiculous. Come home so we can talk like adults. You're overreacting. Let me explain. You're going to regret this." She blocked his number without reading further. By noon, Clara was in Edinburgh, 500 kilometers from London, checked into a boutique hotel under her mother's maiden name. She sat on the bed surrounded by her documents, her evidence, her proof of Charles's systematic fraud. And then Clara Bennett began to plan not just her revenge, but her resurrection. Because Charles Whitmore had made one critical mistake. He'd assumed that taking everything from her would break her. He'd forgotten that she'd started with nothing once before. She knew how to build from the ground up. She knew how to be ruthless when necessary. And most importantly, she knew exactly where all his vulnerabilities were hidden. He'd studied her for years, learning her patterns, her weaknesses, her blind spots, but she'd studied him too. She just hadn't realized she was gathering intelligence. Now she would use every piece of information she possessed. And when she was finished, Charles Whitmore would understand what it truly meant to lose everything. The game had just begun, and this time, Clara was setting the rules. 3 days in Edinburgh, and Clara had transformed from a devastated wife into something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She'd commandeered a corner suite in the Balmoral Hotel, the kind of room that overlooked Edinburgh Castle and came with enough space to spread out her entire operation. The mahogany desk was now covered in laptops, legal pads filled with notes in her precise architectural hand, and printouts of every document she'd photographed from Charles's briefcase. Maya had come through spectacularly. The passwords were changed, the accounts secured, and their attorney, a sharp woman named Victoria Cross, who specialized in corporate warfare, had spent 6 hours on a video call walking Clara through exactly what legal recourse she had. The news wasn't entirely encouraging, but it wasn't hopeless either. "He's been clever," Victoria had said, her face grave on the laptop screen. "The forgeries are good enough that if he'd managed to file them before you discovered everything, you'd be fighting an uphill battle. But he made one mistake. He kept the originals. That shows intent. That shows premeditation." "What about the Heathrow project?" Clara had asked, her voice steady despite the rage simmering beneath her skin. "It's still yours. The board has your legitimate signatures on file, and I've already contacted them with a legal notice that someone may attempt to impersonate you. They're taking it seriously. Fraud on this scale is a criminal matter, not just civil." But Victoria's next words had been harder to hear. "Clara, prosecuting him will be expensive, time-consuming, and public, very public. Your name will be in every trade publication. Every rival firm will see your personal drama played out in court filings. Are you prepared for that?" Clara had looked out at Edinburgh Castle, that ancient fortress that had withstood sieges for centuries, and said simply, "Yes." Because she understood now that this wasn't just about punishing Charles. It was about making sure no other woman ever suffered what he'd planned for her. Men like him operated in shadows, relying on their victims' shame to keep them silent. Clara refused to be silent, but prosecution would take time, months, maybe years, and in the meantime she had a business to protect and a reputation to rebuild. That's where Maya came in. "Tell me everything," Maya had said when she arrived in Edinburgh the next morning, settling into the suite with her own laptop and a determination that reminded Clara why she'd made Maya her second-in-command. So Clara told her. About the forged contracts. About Charles's systematic infiltration of her firm. About the fake emails and the planned resignation letter. Maya's expression had grown progressively darker, her fingers flying across her keyboard as she took notes. "That bastard," Maya breathed when Clara finished. "That absolute bastard. Clara, did you know he approached me 3 months ago?" Clara's head snapped up. "What?" "He took me to lunch. Said it was about surprising you for your anniversary, but he asked a lot of questions about firm operations, client contacts, how the bidding process worked for major projects. I thought he was just trying to understand your world better." Maya's voice was thick with guilt. "I told him things, Clara. Not everything, but enough. God, I'm so sorry." "It's not your fault," Clara said firmly. "He's a professional con artist. He's been doing this his entire life, probably. We were just his biggest score." But Maya's revelation opened another door in Clara's understanding. She pulled up Charles's background, information she'd never thought to scrutinize carefully before. Why would she? He'd come with credentials from Cambridge, a position at a prestigious banking firm, references from respected colleagues. Now she looked deeper. The banking firm existed, but Charles's role there was far less impressive than he'd claimed. He wasn't a director. He was a mid-level analyst whose career had plateaued years ago. The Cambridge degree was real, but he'd graduated with mediocre marks and no honors. The family wealth he'd implied. His parents owned a modest home in Surrey, not the estate she'd imagined. Everything about Charles Whitmore was inflated, enhanced, carefully curated to present an image of success that didn't quite match reality. "He's a social climber," Maya said, reading over Clara's shoulder. "He saw you as his ticket up." "He saw me as his ticket, period," Clara corrected. "The plan wasn't to support my career, it was to replace it with his own, take my reputation, my contacts, my projects, and present himself as the talent while I disappeared into obscurity." The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He'd been willing to destroy her professionally, to erase 5 years of her work, just so he could wear her achievements like a stolen coat. Clara's phone buzzed again. Not Charles this time, but her mother. She'd been avoiding the call for days, but finally answered. "Clara, darling, I've been worried sick," her mother said. "Are you all right?" The concern in her mother's voice nearly broke Clara's composure, but she breathed through it, pushed down the emotion and said, "I'm fine, Mum. I'm in Edinburgh. I left Charles." The silence on the other end lasted 3 heartbeats, then, "Thank God. I never liked him." Clara almost laughed. "You never said anything. You loved him, or you thought you did." What mother tells her daughter she's making a mistake when she's finally happy? Her mother paused. "But I knew love. Something about him always felt off, too smooth, too interested in your work. Men who are secure don't need to constantly remind you how supportive they're being." It was true. Charles had made a performance of his support, as if he deserved credit for not actively sabotaging her. Real support was quiet, unconditional. It didn't come with receipts. "He tried to steal my firm, Mum, forge my signature on contracts, take credit for my designs. If I hadn't found the documents when I did..." Clara trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "But you did find them," her mother said firmly. "And now you'll fight back. That's what we do, Clara. We don't let anyone take what's ours without a battle." After they hung up, Clara felt steadier. Her mother was right. This was a battle, and she intended to win. Over the next several days, Clara and Maya worked 18-hour shifts, mapping out Charles's entire infiltration of the firm. They discovered fake vendor accounts he'd set up to siphon small amounts of money, never enough to trigger audits, but totaling nearly £50,000 over 2 years. They found emails he'd deleted from the server, recovered through backups, showing him corresponding with competitors about Clara's designs. The most damning evidence came from his personal laptop, which he'd carelessly synced to the home network. Maya, who'd studied computer security before pivoting to architecture, managed to access his files remotely. "Clara," Maya said, her voice shaking, "you need to see this." The folder was labeled Heathrow Transition Plan. Inside were documents outlining Charles's entire strategy, when he'd file the forged contracts, how he'd convince the board that Clara was having a breakdown and needed to step back, even a drafted announcement of his takeover that would frame him as reluctantly stepping up to save the project. He'd planned everything down to the press release. Clara read through each document with clinical detachment, her anger crystallizing into something colder and more useful. This wasn't just fraud. This was calculated, premeditated destruction. "He was going to have you committed," Maya whispered, pointing to one particularly chilling document. "Look, he's been documenting erratic behavior for months, mood swings, paranoia. He was building a case to have you declared mentally unstable." Clara's hands tightened on the laptop. Charles hadn't just wanted her firm. He'd wanted to make sure she could never fight back, never rebuild, never threaten his stolen empire. "He forgot one thing," Clara said quietly. "What's that?" "I'm not actually unstable, I'm just extremely angry, and unlike him, I'm good at what I do." Victoria called that afternoon with an update. "The board is furious. They want to meet with you tomorrow in London. They're also initiating their own investigation into Charles. If even half of what you've sent me checks out, he's facing criminal charges." "I'll be there," Clara said. "There's something else." Victoria hesitated. "Charles has hired a lawyer, a very expensive, very aggressive one. He's claiming you stole from the firm, that you've had substance abuse problems, that the marriage fell apart because of your mental health issues." So it had begun. Charles was deploying his backup plan, trying to paint Clara as the villain before she could establish the truth. "Let him," Clara said. "I have documentation of everything. Bank statements, emails, the forged contracts. His lies won't hold up under scrutiny." "This is going to get ugly," Victoria warned. "Good," Clara replied. "I'd hate for him to think I was going easy on him." That night, alone in her hotel suite, Clara allowed herself one moment of grief. Not for Charles. She felt nothing for him now except contempt, but for the woman she'd been, the one who'd trusted too easily, who'd confused charm with character, who'd been so hungry for acceptance that she'd overlooked every warning sign. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone harder, wiser, and infinitely more dangerous. Clara pulled up the Heathrow designs on her laptop, her real designs, the ones she'd poured her soul into. They were magnificent, soaring glass structures that played with light and space, terminals that would transform the experience of travel into something approaching art. This was her legacy, her contribution to the world. Charles had wanted to steal it because he was incapable of creating anything remotely this beautiful himself. She zoomed in on one particular detail, a section of the design she'd never shared with anyone, not even Maya. A hidden signature worked into the architectural elements so subtly that only someone who knew where to look would find it. Her initials, CB, formed by the intersection of support beams and glass panels. Every building she'd ever designed had one. Her secret mark, her proof of creation. Charles could forge her signature on contracts all he wanted, but he could never forge this, the undeniable evidence that these designs came from her vision, her hand, her mind. Tomorrow, she'd return to London. She'd face the board, the lawyers, the inevitable media storm. She'd watch Charles's carefully constructed lies crumble under the weight of evidence. And she'd reclaim everything he'd tried to take. But tonight, Clara Bennett allowed herself to imagine the moment Charles would realize he'd lost, the moment he'd understand that he'd miscalculated catastrophically, that the woman he'd underestimated was the architect of his own destruction. She smiled in the darkness of her hotel room, cold and satisfied. Phase 1 was complete. She'd gathered her evidence, secured her assets, and prepared her defense. Now came Phase 2, total war. And Charles Whitmore had no idea what was coming for him. The boardroom of the Heathrow Development Corporation occupied the 52nd floor of a glass tower in Canary Wharf, with views stretching across London like a topographical map of power. Clara had been here before, 3 times in fact, each visit marking a milestone in the approval process for her design. But this morning felt different. This morning she was walking into a room where her professional life would either be validated or destroyed. Maya accompanied her, carrying 3 identical folders containing every piece of evidence they'd compiled. Victoria Cross, their attorney, had arrived earlier to brief the board's legal team. The message was clear. Clara Bennett was coming armed with facts, not hysteria. Charles was already there when they entered. He sat at the conference table flanked by his own attorney, a man named Gerald Whitfield, whose reputation for aggressive defense preceded him like a thundercloud. Charles looked polished, composed, every inch the successful professional in his perfectly tailored suit. When he saw Clara, something flickered across his face. Surprise, perhaps. He'd expected her to hide, to crumble, to play the role of traumatized victim. Instead, she walked in like she owned the building. "Clara," he said, his voice warm with false concern. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about getting you some help." She didn't respond, didn't even look at him directly. Instead, she addressed the board chairman, Marcus Rothwell, a man in his 60s who'd built his fortune on infrastructure projects across 3 continents. "Thank you for seeing me on such short notice," Clara said, her voice calm and professional. "I apologize for the disruption to your schedule, but recent events have necessitated this meeting." Marcus gestured to the empty chair across from Charles. "Please, sit. We're eager to understand what's happened." Maya distributed the folders while Clara took her seat. She watched Charles' attorney flip through the contents, saw the man's expression shift from confident to concerned to quietly horrified. "What is this?" Charles demanded, reaching for his copy. "What lies are you?" "I'd advise you to let your attorney review the materials before you speak," Victoria cut in smoothly. "You'll want him to advise you on which statements might be considered admissions of guilt." The room fell silent except for the whisper of pages turning. Clara watched the board members read, saw their faces harden as they absorbed the evidence. The forged signatures, the fake emails, the financial records showing systematic theft, the most damning documents of all, Charles's own files, outlining his plan to steal her company. It took 15 minutes. 15 minutes that felt like 15 hours, the weight of silence pressing down on all of them. Finally, Marcus looked up. His gaze moved from Clara to Charles, and there was no warmth left in his expression. "Mr. Whitmore," he said slowly, "according to these documents, you attempted to defraud not only your wife, but this board and the Heathrow Corporation. You forged legal documents. You created false correspondence. You attempted to assume credit for work that was not yours." Charles's face had gone pale. "This is a misunderstanding. Clara and I had an arrangement she never signed off on," Victoria interjected, "an arrangement documented only in your own files, with her signatures forged on every relevant document." "She's mentally unstable," Charles tried, desperation creeping into his voice. "She's been having episodes, paranoid delusions. I was trying to protect the project while getting her treatment." Clara finally looked at him directly. "Produce evidence." "What?" "Evidence of my mental instability. Medical records, witnesses who can testify to these episodes you claim I've been having. Documentation from mental health professionals, anything at all that supports your story." Her voice was ice. "I'll wait." Charles opened his mouth, closed it, looked to his attorney for help. Whitfield could only shake his head minutely. There was no evidence because it had never happened. The whole story was a desperate fabrication, and everyone in the room knew it. "We have forensic analysts reviewing the forged signatures," Victoria continued. "We have computer experts examining the metadata on every suspicious document. We have financial investigators tracking every unauthorized transaction. Mr. Whitmore, you're not facing a marital dispute. You're facing multiple felony charges." The color drained from Charles's face entirely. He'd spent years building this con, convinced of his own cleverness, certain that Clara would never discover the truth, until it was too late. And even if she did, he'd believed she'd be too devastated, too ashamed, too broken to fight back. He'd been wrong on every count. Marcus turned to Clara. "Ms. Bennett, on behalf of this board and the Heathrow Corporation, I want to apologize. We were nearly complicit in fraud against you, and that's unacceptable. Your designs are brilliant, your work has been impeccable, and you deserve better than this betrayal." "Thank you," Clara said quietly. "I appreciate that, but I need to know, is my project secure? Because if it's not, if there's any doubt about my ability to lead this development, I need to know now." "Your project is absolutely secure," Marcus assured her. In fact, I'd like to propose we increase security measures around all communications regarding the development. Mr. Whitmore clearly had access to sensitive information he shouldn't have possessed. Charles exploded. You can't just believe her. She's lying. She's manipulating all of you. That's what she does. She manipulates people into thinking she's some kind of victim when really she's... Enough. Marcus's voice cracked like a whip. Mr. Whitmore, you are no longer welcome in this building or at any meeting related to Heathrow Corporation business. Security will see you out. And if I were you, I'd start cooperating with the authorities, because based on what I'm seeing here, you're going to need all the goodwill you can manufacture. Security appeared as if summoned by magic. Two large men in uniform flanked Charles, waiting. His attorney was already packing up his briefcase, clearly eager to distance himself from a case that was looking increasingly indefensible. As Charles stood, he made one last attempt to regain control. He looked at Clara, and his expression shifted into something she recognized. The charm offensive, the manipulation tactic he'd used 1,000 times before. Clara, he said softly, please, we can work this out. We've been married for 5 years. That has to mean something. I made mistakes, I admit that, but we can fix this. Come home. We'll go to counseling. I'll make it right. For a moment the room held its breath. Then Clara smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. Charles, she said, the most valuable thing you ever taught me was how to recognize a liar. You did that by being such an exceptional example of one. So no, I won't come home. I won't go to counseling. I won't give you another opportunity to steal from me. She stood, gathering her materials. I'll work with the authorities to ensure you face appropriate consequences for what you've done. Not because I hate you, I don't feel strongly enough about you to hate you, but because other people need to know what you are. They need to be protected from you. Clara walked toward the door, Maya beside her, and didn't look back. Behind her she heard Charles being escorted out, heard him trying to argue with security, heard his voice fading as he was removed from the building. In the elevator, Maya finally exhaled. That was the most badass thing I've ever witnessed. Clara leaned against the wall, letting herself feel the adrenaline that had been pushing her through the meeting. Phase 2 complete. What's Phase 3? Reconstruction, Clara said, both personal and professional. They emerged into the London afternoon, the city sprawling around them in all its chaotic glory. Clara breathed in the autumn air, feeling lighter than she had in years. The weight of her marriage, of Charles's constant presence, of the lies she'd been living without knowing it. All of it had been lifted. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. It's done, she said when her mother answered. He's finished. And you, her mother asked, how are you? Clara considered the question honestly. How was she? Tired, angry, relieved, vindicated. But also something else, something she hadn't expected. I'm free, she said finally. For the first time in 5 years, I'm actually free. That afternoon, Clara and Maya returned to the firm's office in Shoreditch. The space occupied the top 2 floors of a converted warehouse, all exposed brick and industrial windows, the kind of creative environment that fostered innovation. Clara had designed the office herself, creating spaces that balance collaboration and privacy, inspiration and focus. The staff had been briefed on the situation. There was no point in secrecy when the legal proceedings would become public soon enough. When Clara walked in, she was met with applause. Her team, 20 talented architects and designers who'd chosen to work for her because they believed in her vision, showed their support in the most straightforward way possible. Thank you, Clara said, her voice catching slightly. Thank you all. I know this has been disruptive and confusing, but I want you to know that the firm is secure, the Heathrow project is moving forward, and we're going to be fine. Better than fine, called out James, one of her senior designers. "We're going to be bloody brilliant, without any parasites stealing credit." Laughter rippled through the office, and Clara felt something ease in her chest. This was her real family, not Charles, with his false promises and hidden agendas. These people, who created beauty out of empty spaces, who trusted her leadership, who showed up every day to build something meaningful. She spent the rest of the afternoon in her office, reviewing designs and approving proposals, slipping back into the rhythm of work that had always been her sanctuary. Architecture made sense in a way human relationships often didn't. Buildings didn't lie about their structural integrity. Materials didn't pretend to be something they weren't. And if you designed something well, it would stand for decades, a testament to vision and skill. As evening descended over London, Maya knocked on her door. "There's someone here to see you," says she's a journalist from the Financial Times. She's heard about Charles and wants your side of the story. Clara's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't want media attention, didn't want her personal drama splashed across newspapers. But then she remembered what Victoria had said about Charles's kind operating in shadows. Send her in, Clara decided. The journalist was younger than Clara expected, perhaps 30, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Her name was Sarah Chen, and she came armed with a recorder and a notebook, already half filled with notes. "Miss Bennett," Sarah said, "I appreciate you seeing me. I've been following your career for several years. Your work is extraordinary." "Thank you," Clara said cautiously. "I've also been investigating Charles Whitmore," Sarah continued. "What happened to you isn't the first time he's attempted something like this. I've found 3 other women whose careers he infiltrated and nearly destroyed. They didn't press charges. They were too afraid of the publicity, the professional damage, the scrutiny. But I think their stories need to be told." Clara sat forward. 3 others. Sarah nodded. One was a tech entrepreneur. He married her, convinced her to make him CFO of her startup, then attempted to transfer ownership while she was on a business trip. She only discovered it because her attorney flagged the suspicious paperwork. She divorced him but didn't pursue charges, took a settlement and signed an NDA. And the others? A gallery owner in Paris, a music producer in Berlin, same pattern, charm, marriage, infiltration, attempted theft. They all got out before he succeeded, but just barely. And they all stayed silent because he threatened to destroy their reputations if they spoke out. Clara felt sick. She'd thought she was Charles's only victim, his magnum opus of deception. But she was just the latest in a series, the one who happened to be most successful and therefore most worth stealing from. "Why are you telling me this?" Clara asked. "Because you're the first one willing to fight back publicly," Sarah said. "And I think if you're willing to go on record, the others might be too. We could stop him from ever doing this again." Clara thought about those 3 women, about how they'd lived with the shame and fear of what Charles had nearly done to them. She thought about future women who might cross his path, who might be charmed and manipulated and destroyed if no one warned them. "I'll do it," Clara said. "Tell me what you need." They talked for 2 hours. Clara told her story from beginning to end, holding nothing back. The journalist asked smart questions, followed threads of investigation, treated Clara's experience with the seriousness it deserved. By the end, Sarah was shaking her head in disgust. "Men like him make me ashamed to be human," Sarah said, "but women like you restore my faith. You could have hidden. You could have taken a settlement and moved on quietly. Instead, you're fighting." "I'm fighting because I can," Clara said simply. "I have resources, I have evidence, I have a platform. Those other women didn't, but maybe now they will." After Sarah left, Clara stood at her office window watching London's lights flicker to life across the city. Millions of people living their lives, pursuing their dreams, building their futures. Some of them were predators like Charles, but most were just people trying to do their best, to create something meaningful, to leave the world slightly better than they found it. That's what Clara wanted. Not revenge, ultimately. Though Charles deserved everything coming to him, she wanted to build, to create spaces that inspired people, to prove that talent and integrity mattered more than manipulation and theft. Her phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. Crown Prosecution Service has formally opened an investigation. Charles has been interviewed under caution. His attorney is pushing for a plea deal. Clara typed back, "No deals, full prosecution." She wasn't interested in mercy for someone who'd shown her none. Charles had spent years planning her destruction, and he would have succeeded if she'd been less observant, less capable, less willing to fight back. Now he would face consequences, real ones, the kind that came with criminal convictions and prison sentences and ruined reputations that could never be rebuilt. Maya appeared in the doorway. "Come on, we're taking you to dinner, the whole team. We're celebrating the fact that you're the most badass architect in London." Clara laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuine happiness. "I'm not sure that's what we should be celebrating." "We're celebrating you," Maya said firmly. "Your talent, your strength, your refusal to let some mediocre con artist steal what you built. That deserves celebration." They went to a pub in Shoreditch, the kind of place where architects and artists gathered after work, where creativity flowed as freely as the beer. Clara found herself surrounded by her team, by people who valued her for her actual contributions, not what they could steal from her. Somewhere across London, Charles was probably meeting with his attorney, probably strategizing about how to minimize his exposure, probably still believing he could talk his way out of consequences. Let him believe it. Let him waste his time and money on false hope. Clara Bennett had already moved on. She had buildings to design, a project to complete, a company to run, and most importantly, she had her freedom, her integrity, and her name intact. Charles had tried to take everything from her. Instead, he'd given her the greatest gift imaginable: clarity. She knew exactly who she was now, exactly what she was capable of, exactly how much strength she possessed. And that knowledge was worth more than any marriage, any false promise, any stolen moment of security. Clara raised her glass with her team and smiled. Not because she'd won, though she had, but because she'd remembered who she was before Charles tried to convince her she was someone else. And that woman, the architect from Yorkshire who'd built an empire from nothing, was unstoppable. 6 weeks after leaving Charles, Clara Bennett stood in the departure lounge at Heathrow Airport and felt the profound irony of the situation. She was about to board a flight to Dubai to present her terminal designs, the very designs Charles had tried to steal at the Middle East Architecture Summit. The invitation had come 3 days after the Financial Times published Sarah Chen's article exposing Charles's pattern of fraud. Apparently, standing up to a con artist had significantly raised Clara's professional profile. The article had been devastating in its thoroughness. Sarah had managed to contact all 3 of Charles's previous victims, and with Clara leading the charge, they'd all agreed to go on record. The story painted a portrait of a man who'd spent a decade targeting successful women, marrying them not for love, but for access to their achievements. The response had been overwhelming. Within hours of publication, Clara's firm had received calls from organizations wanting her to speak about her experience. Universities requested her for panels on professional ethics, and most significantly, 3 major architectural firms had reached out about potential partnerships, impressed by both her designs and her refusal to be victimized. But the best response had come from an unexpected source. Charles's own firm had fired him. Apparently, systematic fraud against one's spouse reflected poorly on the company's reputation. Who would have thought? Maya settled into the seat next to Clara, already pulling out her laptop. Okay, so in Dubai, we're meeting with the Abu Dhabi Development Authority about their new cultural district. They specifically requested you, after reading the article, said they wanted an architect with integrity. Clara smiled. Integrity is apparently good for business. Turns out people don't love fraudsters, Maya agreed. Weird, right? The flight to Dubai gave Clara time to reflect on how much had changed in such a short period. The criminal investigation into Charles was progressing rapidly. His plea deal had been rejected, and he was now facing trial on multiple counts of fraud, forgery, and identity theft. His expensive attorney had been replaced by a court-appointed one after his assets were frozen pending investigation. Charles himself had tried calling her repeatedly, messages ranging from threatening to pathetic. His last voicemail had been almost incoherent, blaming her for destroying his life, accusing her of vindictiveness, claiming she'd overreacted to a simple misunderstanding. Clara had forwarded it to her attorney and blocked the new number. She was done being an audience for his delusions. The divorce proceedings were equally straightforward. Charles had no grounds to contest anything. The prenuptial agreement Clara's attorney had insisted on was ironclad, and Charles's fraud had voided any claims he might have had to shared assets. The marriage would be dissolved within months, and Clara would walk away with everything that had been hers to begin with, which was exactly as it should be. Dubai emerged from the darkness like a constellation that had fallen to earth, towers of light piercing the desert night. Clara had been here once before, years ago, and had been intimidated by the scale of everything. Now she saw it as potential. Every building represented someone's vision made real, someone's dream transformed into steel and glass. The summit was being held at the Burj Al Arab, that sail-shaped hotel that had become synonymous with Dubai's ambitions. Clara's presentation was scheduled for the second day, giving her time to attend other sessions and network with architects from across the globe. What she didn't expect was the number of people who wanted to meet her specifically. "Miss Bennett?" A woman approached her during the first morning's coffee break. She was perhaps 50, elegant, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. "I'm Amara Khalil. I head the architectural division for the Dubai Cultural Authority. I wanted to tell you that your story resonated with many of us. I divorced my husband 7 years ago after discovering he'd been claiming my government contracts were actually his connections. Seeing you fight back publicly, it mattered." Clara found herself in conversation after conversation with women and some men who'd experienced variations of what she'd endured. Partners who took credit for their work, spouses who undermined their confidence while stealing their clients, colleagues who passed off their designs as their own. The architecture world, Clara realized, was full of talented people whose achievements had been stolen or diminished by those they'd trusted. "It's an epidemic," said Marcus Rothwell, appearing at her elbow during lunch. He'd flown out specifically to support Clara's presentation. "Happens more than anyone wants to admit, but it's usually handled quietly. Settlements, NDAs, people moving to different firms. You're the first person in my 30 years in this industry who's been willing to make it truly public." "I didn't want to," Clara admitted. "I wanted to handle it discreetly, professionally. But then I learned about the other women, and I realized silence was helping Charles more than it was protecting me." "Well, you've started a conversation that needed to happen," Marcus said. "And between you and me, your willingness to fight has made the board even more confident in your leadership. They see someone who won't compromise on integrity, won't back down under pressure. Those are exactly the qualities we need in someone overseeing a £200 million project." Clara's presentation on the second day was standing room only. She'd expected a professional audience interested in terminal design. What she got was a crowd that included architects, yes, but also journalists, business leaders, and women from various industries who'd heard her story and wanted to hear her speak. She stood at the podium, looking out at hundreds of faces, and made a decision to deviate from her prepared remarks. "I came here today to talk about architecture," she began. "About how we design spaces for human movement, how we balance aesthetics with functionality, how we create buildings that don't just house activities, but enhance them. And I will talk about those things because they're important. They're why I became an architect." She clicked to the next slide, her Heathrow designs soaring and beautiful. "But first, I want to talk about something equally important. I want to talk about what happens when someone tries to take your work and claim it as their own. Not just the legal ramifications or the professional damage, but what it does to you, personally, psychologically, spiritually." The room was absolutely silent. 6 weeks ago, I discovered that my husband had been systematically planning to steal my company, my designs, and my reputation. He'd spent years positioning himself to take everything I'd built. And when I found out, my first instinct wasn't anger. It was shame. Clara saw heads nodding throughout the audience. I felt ashamed that I'd been fooled, ashamed that I'd trusted someone who didn't deserve it, ashamed that I'd been so focused on my work that I'd missed all the warning signs. And I almost let that shame keep me silent. I almost took a settlement, signed an NDA, and disappeared. She advanced to the next slide, the Financial Times article. But then I realized something. His crime wasn't just against me. It was against every woman he'd targeted before me, and every woman he might target in the future. And my silence would be complicity in his pattern. If you're rooting for her like I am, show it by hitting the like button. And if you want to see more mini-novels like this, subscribe to the channel, because there's so much more coming your way. So I fought back. I documented everything. I hired excellent attorneys. I went to the authorities. And I told my story publicly, even though it meant admitting I'd been deceived, even though it meant facing judgment and scrutiny. Clara smiled. "And you know what happened? The world didn't end. My career didn't collapse. Instead, I found an entire community of people who'd experienced similar betrayals, who'd been waiting for someone to speak up, who needed to know they weren't alone." She clicked to her final slide, a photograph of her team at the firm, all of them grinning at the camera. This is what matters. The work we create, the people we work with, the integrity we bring to our profession. Someone tried to take this from me, and he failed. Not because I'm special or unusually strong, but because I refused to let him redefine my story. The applause was deafening. After the presentation, Clara was mobbed. Business cards pressed into her hands, invitations to speak at other conferences, requests for interviews. But the most meaningful conversations were with the women who quietly approached her with their own stories, their own battles against partners and colleagues who'd tried to steal their work. "Thank you for speaking up," one woman said, tears in her eyes. "My ex-husband took credit for my software algorithms. I've been too afraid to say anything because he's well connected. But seeing you fight back, maybe I can too." "You can," Clara assured her, "and you should, because people like them rely on our silence to keep operating." That evening, Clara and Maya sat on the balcony of their hotel room, looking out at Dubai's impossible skyline. The city glittered like a promise, like proof that vision and ambition could create something from nothing. "Do you miss him at all?" Maya asked quietly. "Charles, I mean." Clara considered the question honestly. Did she miss any part of her marriage? The companionship, the routine, the illusion of partnership? "No," she said finally. "I miss who I thought he was, but that person never existed. The real Charles was always the con artist, always the predator. I don't miss that." "Do you think you'll trust anyone again?" Maya asked. "Romantically, I mean." Clara smiled. Eventually. When I'm ready, but I'll trust differently. I'll trust based on actions, not words. On consistency over time, not charm in the moment. And I'll never ever trust someone more than I trust myself. Her phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. Trial date set for March. Crown prosecution is confident. They want you to testify. Clara typed back, I'll be there. She would stand in that courtroom and tell her story again. She would face Charles across a legal proceeding and demonstrate one final time that his manipulation had no power over her anymore, and then she would walk out of that courthouse and never think about him again. Because Charles Whitmore had been a chapter in her life, not the whole book. And Clara Bennett was the author of her own story. The Dubai Cultural Authority offered her a commission the next day, a new performing arts center that would showcase traditional and contemporary Middle Eastern art. It was smaller than the Heathrow project, but prestigious and creatively challenging. We want an architect who understands that buildings should serve the people who use them, not the ego of the designer, Amara Khalil explained. Your work shows that understanding, and your character shows the integrity we need in a partner. Clara accepted. On the flight back to London, Maya asked, So what's next? Heathrow, Dubai, running the firm, probably 3 more projects we don't even know about yet. How are you going to manage it all? The same way I've always managed it, Clara said. One design at a time, one decision at a time, one day at a time. She looked out the window at the clouds below, solid as ground from this height. Everything looked different from above, smaller, more manageable, less overwhelming. That's what the past 6 weeks had taught her, that challenges that seemed insurmountable from ground level became navigable when you changed your perspective. That betrayal that felt world-ending was actually just one person's failure of character, not a reflection on her worth. Charles had tried to destroy her and failed. In the process, he'd actually made her stronger, more visible, more connected to a community of people who valued authenticity and integrity. He'd wanted to steal her success. Instead, he'd multiplied it. And Clara Bennett, the girl from Yorkshire who'd come to London with nothing but talent and determination, was just getting started. The best revenge, it turned out, wasn't revenge at all. It was excellence. The courtroom was smaller than Clara had imagined, more mundane. She'd envisioned something grand and intimidating, with soaring ceilings and dramatic lighting. Instead, it was just a room, practical, efficient, designed for the business of justice rather than its theatre. But the March morning she walked in to testify against Charles Whitmore, it felt like the most important space she'd ever occupied. 4 months had passed since she'd left their Kensington townhouse, 4 months of relentless work, personal reconstruction, and professional triumph. The Heathrow designs were in the implementation phase. The Dubai Commission was progressing beautifully. And Clara's firm had hired 5 new architects to handle the influx of projects that had materialized after the Financial Times article. She'd also been invited to join the board of an organization supporting women in architecture, had spoken at 3 universities about professional integrity, and had been profiled in Architectural Digest as one of the industry's rising stars. Charles, by contrast, had lost everything. His job, his reputation, his freedom. He'd been denied bail after attempting to flee the country, and now, sitting at the defense table between his overwhelmed public defender and a court officer, he looked diminished, smaller than she remembered, less significant. Clara took the witness stand and swore to tell the truth, as if she'd ever done anything else. The Crown prosecutor, a formidable woman named Eleanor Price, led her through her testimony with clinical precision. Clara described discovering the forged documents, the fake accounts, the systematic plan to steal her company. She presented evidence that had been admitted into the record: photographs, financial statements, Charles's own files outlining his scheme. Charles's attorney tried to paint her as vindictive, as a woman scorned fabricating charges. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Clara's calm, factual testimony left no room for doubt. "Ms. Bennett," the prosecutor asked, "why did you decide to pursue criminal charges rather than simply divorcing your husband and moving on?" Clara looked directly at the jury. "Because what he did wasn't just about me. He'd done this to other women before. And if I'd stayed silent, he would have done it to someone else. Someone with fewer resources than me. Someone who might not have discovered the fraud in time. Someone whose entire career would have been destroyed." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I had the privilege of being able to fight back, so I had the responsibility to do so, not for revenge, for protection of myself and of others." The defense attorney cross-examined her, trying to rattle her, trying to find inconsistencies in her story. But there were none. Clara had told the truth from the beginning, and the truth didn't change under scrutiny. When she stepped down from the witness stand, she finally looked at Charles. Really looked at him, perhaps for the first time since she'd discovered his betrayal. He looked back at her with something she hadn't expected to see: genuine bewilderment, as if he still couldn't understand why she'd fought back, why she hadn't simply accepted his theft as inevitable. In that moment, Clara understood something fundamental about Charles. He genuinely believed he was entitled to her success, that being married to her gave him ownership of her achievements, that his charm and his Cambridge degree mattered more than her actual talent and years of hard work. He'd never seen her as an equal. He'd seen her as a resource to be exploited. And that, Clara realized, was the saddest thing about him. Not his crimes, though they were significant, but his complete inability to value another person's humanity, creativity, and autonomy. The trial lasted another 3 days. The prosecution presented witness after witness: the other women Charles had targeted, forensic accountants who'd traced his thefts, digital experts who'd confirmed the forgeries. The evidence was so overwhelming that Charles's attorney didn't even call him to testify. There was no defense to offer except apologize and hope for leniency. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. Clara wasn't in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She'd returned to work, trusting the justice system to do what it would. Maya called her with the news. "It's over," Maya said. "He's done. Sentencing is in 6 weeks, but Victoria says he's looking at minimum 5 years, probably more." Clara set down her pencil. She'd been sketching details for the Dubai Performing Arts Centre and let herself feel the finality of it. 5 years ago, she'd married a man she thought she loved. Now that man would spend the next half-decade in prison, paying for crimes he'd committed against her and others. She felt no triumph, no particular satisfaction, just a quiet sense of closure, like the final line on a set of architectural plans. "Thank you for letting me know," Clara said. "Now let's get back to work. These windows won't design themselves." That evening, Clara stood in her new apartment in Notting Hill, a space she'd chosen herself, decorated herself, filled with furniture that reflected her taste alone. No compromises, no second-guessing whether Charles would approve of the art on the walls or the books on the shelves. It was smaller than the Kensington townhouse, but it was entirely hers. Her mother called. "I heard about the verdict." "News travels fast," Clara said. "Your face is on the BBC website," her mother replied dryly. "Architect wins justice against fraudulent husband. You're famous, love." "I'm really not interested in being famous for this," Clara said. "I'd much rather be famous for the Heathrow terminal." "You'll be famous for both," her mother predicted. But more importantly, you'll be free of him, free of the lies, free to build whatever you want. After they hung up, Clara opened her laptop and looked at her current projects. Heathrow, Dubai, a residential commission in Barcelona. A museum renovation in Edinburgh, a potential project in Singapore that was still in early discussions. Every single one of them existed because of her talent, her vision, her years of work. No one had given her these opportunities out of pity or charity. She'd earned them through excellence and integrity. Charles had tried to steal that, had spent years plotting to take credit for her achievements, to erase her contributions, to replace her with himself. And he'd failed completely. Because buildings don't lie. Designs don't change authorship just because someone forges a signature. And the architectural community, for all its flaws, ultimately valued substance over manipulation. Clara pulled up the Heathrow designs on her screen. They were even more beautiful now than when she'd first created them, refined through months of collaboration with engineers and contractors. The terminals would soar and swoop, glass and steel, catching light in ways that would make traveling through them an experience rather than an ordeal. In 3 years, when the first phase opened, Clara would attend the dedication ceremony. She'd give speeches about vision and innovation, and somewhere in every structure, hidden in the geometry of support beams and glass panels, would be her signature. CB, woven into the architecture itself. That's what would last, not Charles's fraud. Not the trial, not any of this temporary drama. Her buildings would still be standing when everyone involved in this case was long gone. That was her legacy. That was what mattered. Maya texted, "Dinner tomorrow? My treat. We're celebrating you being officially free." Clara smiled and typed back, "I've been free since the day I walked out, but I'll never turn down free dinner." Because that was the truth. She hadn't needed the verdict to be free. She'd freed herself the moment she stopped believing Charles's lies, about her, about himself, about what their marriage had been. The trial had been about justice, about protecting others, about ensuring consequences for criminal behavior, but her freedom, that had never been in question. 6 weeks later, Clara stood in the Heathrow construction site wearing a hard hat and safety vest. Around her, the skeleton of her design was taking shape. Steel beams reaching skyward, glass panels waiting to be installed, workers moving with purposeful choreography. "It's going to be magnificent," Marcus said beside her. He visited the site monthly, as invested in the project's success as Clara herself. "It is," Clara agreed, "but it was always going to be. This is what I do. I create spaces that work, that inspire, that serve the people who use them." "Indeed, you know," Marcus said thoughtfully, "I've been in this industry for decades. I've seen brilliant architects destroy their careers through arrogance, through negligence, through compromising their integrity. And I've seen mediocre architects stumble into success through politics and connections." He turned to look at her directly. "But rarely do I see someone with both exceptional talent and exceptional character. You have both, Clara. What Charles tried to steal from you wasn't just your designs, it was that combination, the skill and the integrity together. And he failed because you can't steal character. You either have it or you don't." "He didn't have it," Clara said simply. "No," Marcus agreed. "He never did." That evening, Clara received an email from Sarah Chen, the journalist who'd written the original exposé. "Thought you'd want to know. All 3 of Charles's previous victims have filed criminal complaints. Your case gave them the courage to come forward. He'll be facing additional charges when he gets out of prison, if he gets out." Clara read the message twice, then forwarded it to Victoria with a simple note. "This is why we fought. Because justice wasn't just about punishing Charles, it was about protecting future victims. It was about changing the culture that allowed men like him to operate for years without consequences. It was about making it clear that talent belonged to the people who created it, not to whoever could steal it most effectively. A year after leaving Charles, Clara stood in front of 200 university students at a lecture hall in Cambridge. The very university Charles had used as his credential, his passport to credibility he hadn't earned. "You're here to study architecture," she told them, "to learn about design principles, structural integrity, materials science, aesthetics. And those things are vital. You need to know how to create buildings that don't collapse, that serve their purpose, that contribute something beautiful to the world." She clicked to a slide showing one of her completed projects, a community centre in Leeds that had won several awards. "But you also need to learn something they don't teach in most architecture programs. You need to learn how to protect your work, how to recognize when someone is trying to take credit for your ideas, how to document your process so thoroughly that your authorship is indisputable." Clara saw students leaning forward, taking notes. "And most importantly, you need to learn that your talent is yours, not your employer's, not your partner's, not anyone else's. You're responsible for nurturing it, developing it, and defending it when necessary. No one has the right to steal your creativity, no matter what relationship they have with you." After the lecture, a young woman approached her, early 20s, brilliant eyes behind fashionable glasses. "Miss Bennett," she said, "I just wanted to say thank you. My boyfriend has been pressuring me to let him present my senior thesis project as a collaboration, even though he hasn't contributed anything. After hearing your story, I realized I need to say no, even if it means ending the relationship." "Good," Clara said firmly. "Any relationship that requires you to diminish yourself isn't worth maintaining, and anyone who truly loves you would never ask you to share credit you haven't earned." The young woman nodded, tears in her eyes. "I was so afraid of being alone." "Being alone is better than being with someone who treats you as a resource rather than a person," Clara told her. "Trust me, I know from experience." In Bryn, as Clara left Cambridge that evening, driving back to London through the spring twilight, she thought about all the versions of herself she'd been. The struggling student from Yorkshire, the young architect trying to make her mark, the woman who'd married Charles thinking she'd found a partner, the devastated wife discovering systematic betrayal. And now, who was she now? Clara Bennett, architect, award-winning designer, survivor, speaker, advocate, woman who refused to be diminished. But most importantly, herself. Fully, completely, uncompromisingly herself. The Heathrow terminal opened on a brilliant October morning, 2 years after Clara had left Charles. The ceremony was attended by government officials, industry leaders, journalists from around the world. Clara stood at the podium, wearing a suit she'd chosen herself, looking out at a crowd gathered to celebrate her achievement. 5 years ago, she said, I sketched the first concepts for this project in a coffee shop in Shoreditch. I imagined a space that would make travel feel less like an obligation and more like an adventure. A terminal that would welcome people, inspire them, remind them that architecture can be art. She gestured to the soaring glass structure behind her. What you see today is that vision made real, but it's also more than that. It's proof that excellence matters, that integrity matters. That when you create something meaningful and protect it fiercely, it endures. Clara paused, looking at the faces in the crowd. Maya was there, beaming with pride. Marcus Rothwell, Victoria Cross, her mother who'd taken the train down from Yorkshire, even Sarah Chen, the journalist who'd helped her tell her story. Someone once tried to steal this from me, Clara said quietly. Tried to take credit for these designs, for the work that went into them, for the vision they represent. He failed. Not because I'm particularly strong or special, but because truth has a way of asserting itself, and because I refuse to let anyone rewrite my story." The applause was thunderous. After the ceremony, as Clara walked through her completed terminal for the first time as a public space, she felt overwhelming gratitude, not just for her success, but for the journey that had led here, for the betrayal that had forced her to recognize her own strength, for the battle that had taught her she was capable of fighting for herself. She would have preferred not to learn those lessons through Charles's fraud, would have preferred a partner who actually supported rather than stole from her. But given the choice between remaining blind to his true nature and knowing the truth, no matter how painful, she'd choose truth every time. Clara stood in the center of the terminal's main concourse, light streaming through the glass panels she'd designed, travelers moving through the space with the ease she'd intended. This was her cathedral, her contribution to the world, her proof that one woman's vision, protected and pursued with determination, could become something that served thousands of people every day. Charles was serving his sentence in a prison somewhere. She didn't know where, and didn't care. He'd become irrelevant the moment she'd walked out of their townhouse. An unpleasant memory chat grew fainter with each passing month. What mattered was this. Clara Bennett had built something beautiful, and nothing, no betrayal, no fraud, no attempted theft had been able to stop her. She pulled out her phone and called her mother. "I'm standing in the Heathrow terminal," Clara said. "How does it feel?" her mother asked. Clara looked around at her creation, at the light and space and beauty she'd imagined and made real. "It feels," she said, "like freedom."